Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here this evening under the auspices of the Toronto Public Library alongside Peter Kim and Paula Marantz Cohen. And not to jinx things, but given the subjects of these two books, an essay on the civilizing power of conversation, and a book about how relationships are built, broken, and repaired when it comes to trust. If we can't have a good and rigorous conversation with each other, then who really could? So I want to begin our time together, Paula and Peter, with a question that reflects something that comes up at various points in both books. Could you each just say a little bit about the personal, professional, and public reasons why you chose to write How Trust Works? We'll start with you, Peter, and then the same question about the talking cube.
Well, thank you, Randy. So what motivated me to study these issues on a personal front really stems
Mhm.
from my formative years. So I came to the U.S. As a first-generation immigrant with my parents. We moved quite a bit from neighborhood to neighborhood, and through those transitions, I became acutely aware of the role of our social perceptions, how we perceive one another, how that affects the way we relate to one another, and how those perceptions go awry, how we get things wrong, and the problems that can create. And so this was a burning question that was reinforced for throughout my childhood. And as I studied, in graduate school, this question of the role of social perception is very important because the way we relate to one another is through a collaborative process where we socially and collaboratively construct our world. We develop a common understanding of things that we're talking about. We interact to approach a problem in the same way, or coordinate and so on. But if we don't understand one another well, then
Mhm.
all of those processes can get waylaid. And so that was the motivating question for me as a scholar. How do we develop these perceptions? How do they go awry? How do we fix them? Because if we don't, then it can have enormous implications for the way we approach our work, our relationships, and so on.
And then so you've given us now the personal sense, you've given us the professional sense. What are the public stakes? Why, in public terms, do you feel like a book like How Trust Works is something we need right now?
Well, this actually was the primary motivation for writing a public-facing book. So most
Mm.
of my work is on the scientific front, where I do rigorous studies that are published in these journals that most people would not read. But we had reached a point in society where trust is at an all-time low.
Mhm.
And you can see this in every survey out there. Our trust in leaders, in organizations, in our institutions, in governments, in one another. Every survey indicates that it's at an all-time low. And when that's the case, our ability to function as a society is severely impaired. So there's
Mhm.
data that indicates that it has enormous implications, not only for our social well-being, but even for our economy. So it
Mhm.
has real tangible
Got it.
implications on many fronts.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that sense, Peter, of the origin story for How Trust Works. Paula, what about you with the talking cure? Personal, professional, public reasons.
Well, I guess personally, I love to talk. And I came from a family of talkers. I
So you say
enjoy
this early
talking.
on.
Yes, and I start the book by talking about my own family, where I guess I learned to talk, or we learned to talk. But I also feel that, and perhaps it was during COVID, that sense of isolation and wanting to have that connection beyond those immediate people that I was with, and realizing how much that sustains me. I realize that's not true for everyone, but I do
Mhm.
think most of us need some minimum of interaction through conversation, that it enlivens us. And I also wrote it, I suppose, because I saw the university where I have spent my career having less and less time. And one of the reasons I went into university teaching was because I could talk so much with interesting people. But the faculty club is closed, and the bar of yesteryear has long been closed at the university, and people are engaged in their own work, and there is a sense of isolation within the academic community, which worries me, because I think there, of all places, we should be connecting. And I also am a great believer in the seminar, the college seminar, as a place where students learn to connect and to talk across difference. And so just to repeat Peter's point, if you go into the larger world of the public sphere, I think we are seeing the repercussions of this in the fact that we do not seem to be able to talk across difference. And that is a very tragic situation for our country. And for your country too, because I know you're in Canada, I'm in the States, but I think we have the same issue going on for both of us.
Well, I can say on that very point, I'm speaking to all of you from the heart of the University of Toronto, and to my right is an ongoing encampment of students and others who are very much committed to advocating for Palestine and making demands of the university in that context. Right behind me, as we speak, is a counter protest that would be more straightforwardly pro-Israel outside my window. And it seems to me like, to your point just now, Paula, and really to Peter's, there's no conversation happening between these two groups. There seems to be little trust between these two groups, or between the institutions that are meant to create these spaces and mediate this way. So I'm wondering if we could maybe just go there next, about the concept of the institution. Peter, early on in your book, you talk about trust in institutions. Paul, you say a lot about the significance of the university as a space for conversation. Why do you think we put so much investment in institutions as making it possible? Why do we think, take it for granted that we should trust in institutions? Why do we think the university is a place for conversation? I wonder if you could each just speak to that out of your books.
Shall I go first, or Peter, you want to go ahead?
Please, Paula, go ahead.
Okay. Well, the university has traditionally been a place, and I guess a privileged place, where people had the leisure and the matter, the material to engage with each other. I think it's extremely important that we have a vehicle about which to talk. One of the problems that I think has happened in our culture is that people feel, well, I feel this way, and therefore I can talk about it with conviction, as opposed to reading about it or studying it or reading something else, a Shakespeare play, an Emily Dickinson poem, and talking about that as a way to open up ideas. And that seems to be, with the loss of the humanities, which is another issue dear to my heart, or that I lament, I think that the university as an institution has lost its moorings. And I don't know an alternative to that. It's true that we can have our conversations with our friends and so forth, but the university would bring us together, and especially students from different backgrounds would have the opportunity to sit around a table or sit in a lunch room and talk. That's become less viable than it was in the past. And I'll let Peter answer this, and then we can go on from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's so much to say.
Let me maybe reposition what my question by way of Paula's answer and reflections just now. So Peter, from your vantage, where and how should trust figure in an intentional community? We're all part of the university. And yet, despite that, there doesn't seem to be nearly the same kind of taken for granted trust there seems to be a trust deficit, something that I know you're interested in. Can you say a little bit about that and how, and you're interested in it's integrity and is it integrity and competence? What are the two?
Yes, those are the two.
Just say a little bit about those and how that relates to the question of why the university doesn't seem to be a trusted place anymore.
Sure. So, to the question of why we need these institutions,
Yeah.
they help provide the foundation for trust, because institutions, in a way, help establish the rules of the game of how we're going to relate to one another, what should be our baseline expectations. You can think about the system of laws, for example, as essential for us to understand what's considered right and what's considered wrong, and so on. But beyond those foundational elements, there are a lot of gray area questions of like, how do you interpret certain things? And this gets to the matter of competence and integrity. When we view certain acts, we make an attribution of, does this reflect someone, is this an indication of someone having good intentions, but just having made a mistake? That would be a competence-related issue. Or is this a reflection of someone that does not have good values, who lacks integrity? We can make that kind of that choice of attribution for any kind of bad behavior. So if something unexpected happens, is this because they try to get away with something? Did they try to, do they have malevolent intent, or they just make a mistake? And I think what you're seeing right now is a much stronger inclination to impute nefarious intent in others. Yes. It's an attribution of low integrity. And my work has made clear that as soon as you make that attribution, your ability to repair that relationship is severely compromised.
Could I ask Peter a question about this? Because I was just talking with a friend about this very idea of trust and in an institution. And I think what's happened is that we trust our friends because we know them over a length of time, or family members. We know what they're like, we trust them. But it used to be that we trusted our institutions because they had a certain stature, right? Especially the university. And so you didn't need that long-term investment. You just knew that I can trust my professor. I can trust, my colleague, even, and so forth. But I think as these institutions have eroded in trust, we become more tribal, because the only people we can trust are those that we've known over a long term within our family or our group. And that is and that's what I think we're seeing now more than ever. I mean, does that fit with any of the work that you've done?
No, that's a very insightful comment. It does. And what it taps into is that part of what determines this choice of whether you see this bad outcome as being a reflection of competence or someone having poor values is the motivation to preserve the relationship. So if you have a family member that does something questionable, right? We are inclined to see this as a matter of competence, something that could be more easily forgiven because we want to forgive it. We want to maintain that person as a member of our family. If it's the same act by someone we don't really care about maintaining a relationship with, then it's quite easy to say it was a matter of integrity. We have much less to lose. So if we have less stake in the institutions themselves, then we also have less stake in working harder to really understand why this thing happened. Instead, we very easily resort to this attribution that it's a reflection that the institution or that party, whoever that might be, has values that are unacceptable to us.
Peter, can I ask, just to stay on that one point, why though? Why in your research, why is it that I would rather call you out for a lack of integrity than just say you're incompetent? What does that do for me?
Mm.
I think it gets to the way our brains are wired. So we have decision-making scholars would talk about a dual process mode of thinking. So we have a knee-jerk reaction, and then we have a subsequent reaction that requires more deliberation and thought.
Mhm.
And the way we're wired is to very quickly infer that something was a matter of intent. It was an intentional act. Only with time and opportunity to think about alternative explanations do we make the effort to think about things that may actually have been beyond that person's control, that
Mm.
they may not have foreseen. But that takes effort, and that effort often takes a motivation.
Could I also weigh in on this, which is, I think, a
Please.
fascinating point? I also think incompetence and integrity, one is about ability, the other is a moral value. And I think we have moralized the way other people are. And this issue, and I've been many years in academia, and only in the last 10 to 15 has the idea of virtue become such a club with which people can hit each other. And I mean, it used to be, all right, I disagree with you. Maybe your facts are wrong. Maybe you're incompetent. Maybe you're stupid. But the idea that you're bad, I don't think that that came to the fore to quite the same degree. I just don't remember. Whereas now, and it's a disarming and a very difficult argument to counter if you feel that your position has been labeled bad and you're a bad person if you take that point of view. And I think that's what silences many academics, because they feel the shunning of being bad. And, how we can get over that, I don't know, because it's a very unequal sort of situation.
Well, I think it does two things, if I could. You're right. The shunning creates, for the great majority of people, a sense of feeling bad. And then it creates the people who think, yeah, I'm bad. Watch this. And then they go in a very different direction. And they embrace it. Yeah, you're right. This incompetent, integrity lacking institution thinks I'm bad, and I'm going to tell the world now, which is to say, and this is a transition to my next sentence, my next question, that is, where and how you see technology figuring in the problems that we are discussing with respect to trust and with respect to the difficulty of getting into a good conversation. Because Paula, it's something you said earlier, and oddly, Peter, we before we started, we were talking about the fact that none of us are on social media. It's odd to me how easily we're willing to trust on social media in certain groups or certain categories. But can you say a little bit, maybe each of you, whether it's in a seminar room or whether it's in your research into trust, where and how technology intervenes in this discussion? And I'm going to challenge you to go beyond simply saying, yeah, it's terrible, we should all get rid of our phones. So who wants to go first?
Well, I'll go for it first and just say that I think there's a big difference between, I mean, even having a seminar where students have their computers open is a different experience than when you say, no computers, no phones in the classroom. This is a conversation about a text that we are going to have that is you're going to be organic face to face, because those modes of expression intervene the impersonal with the personal. When you see someone's face and body language and you deal with them in person, you cannot dismiss them. You cannot flatten them to the extent that you can on social media or when you are distracted by other kinds of media. And
Yes.
that's where, I mean, it's not just social media and the computer, it's the busyness and the distraction of daily life, of college life, that has gotten in the way. I mean, the leisurely kind, and I get back to conversation as a way of humanizing other people, giving other people the opportunity to be human within your sphere. We have to have that, or we will continue to demonize the other, flatten and reduce them to a, cardboard antagonist. And that is just, it just gets me very, very upset to see that
So
happen.
let me just stay with that upset for a moment, Peter, before I go to you. Now, Paula, I'm in full agreement with you. And I was, in fact, chatting with some students doing a research project on civil discourse here at the University of Toronto earlier this very same day about what it means to join a conversation and be willing to trust each other and engage in difference and disagreement within that conversation without it becoming ad hominem and without it being leading to distraction. But then what about the counter argument that everything you just said presupposes a level of access, a level of capacity, a level of confidence that in our diverse world isn't in fact the case. I mean, you talk about this a little bit in your writings about Wolf in your book, and then likewise with respect to salon culture, the demographic generally tends to be secure white males are able to engage in conversation. How do you counteract that question for people who don't feel reflected in that, but still seek the thing that you're describing?
So the answer is to do away with it because only white males have been able to do it in the past. How about making it available or teaching, making education about that so that others can take joy. I mean, the very fact that a group in the past has gotten pleasure and instruction from a certain kind of conversation doesn't mean then that it is by necessity a bad thing. It means that it really needs to be extended. And that's what education should be. And if I were to critique at its core what higher education has become, I think it has ceased to be education. Because education should be about thought and discussion of an expansive and deep kind. And if you don't have the time and the ability to do it, or you can't be in a situation to learn to do it, you shouldn't want to go to college, or it shouldn't be college. So it's a circular kind of thing. To say, well, they can't do it doesn't necessarily mean then that college should not be about that. I mean, that's the reason why it's failing. College is failing to produce the kinds of citizens that we need. And to then say white men are the only ones that can do it or did it in the past doesn't hold water.
It's an insufficient critique. I hear that very much.
Yeah, there are some things that white men did in the past that had some value that we ought to extend to everyone.
Yes.
Okay.
Now that's going to be quoted against you on social media within about 35 seconds, taken completely out of context. We'll see where that goes.
Right. Okay. I hope not, because
yes, good hope is a good virtue.
Yes.
Peter, I want you to maybe think again about technology, maybe in response to some of the points that Paula just made with respect to the goods of education and then her criticisms of it. And I'd like you to do so specifically by way of that very provocatively entitled chapter of your new book, Beware the Hive Mind. Can you say a little bit about that chapter, if, as I'm predicting, it kind of speaks to what we're talking about right now in this conversation?
Absolutely. So First, related to Paula's comment, I agree that a university setting is, a fantastic opportunity to address some of the dangers of technology, because technology is a simplifying device. It filters out a lot of cues that are very important in conversation, body language, for example, subtlety, and so on. You stop seeing the whole individual, and without seeing that person and all the nuances of what they're trying to convey, then it's easy to simplify. You have less motivation to maintain that relationship. You could just cut the internet connection and so on, or log off. And so there's that motivational element. As far as the hive mind element, the other thing technology does is make it easier for you to find like-minded people in whatever discussion board or forum or what have you.
Mhm.
And it feeds information to you based on your preferences. So you keep getting your preferences reinforced. You're not exposed to alternative views, so you question the merits of your opinions. And what that does is it makes opinions more extreme. So there's this basic psychological effect called group polarization. People in a group, if they have the same view, through discussion, they become even more extreme in their sentiments. And they become more dogmatic as a result.
Mhm.
And this is really problematic with regard to this issue of moralization that Paula mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
because it really gets to this question of what does integrity even mean, right?
Mhm.
This is, a matter of ethics and morality. And most people's understanding of ethics and morality, it's very simplistic. They do not understand the complexities with which people make these judgments. And the behavioral sciences have made enormous strides in understanding this. And it turns out the issue of whether something is moral or amoral, it's not a black and white sort of decision. It's a matter of whether we uphold several principles that we might all share, right? So
Mhm.
the idea of caring for others, the idea of fairness and respect, the idea of taking care of people within our group, and so on. So there are a variety of moral principles. And what happens in the real world is that we ultimately need to make trade-offs amongst these moral principles. They're often difficult situations that require
Yes.
us to make a choice. But the thing is that not all people agree on how those principles should be prioritized. And that's the basis of this problem. So you believe that another person is amoral because they have not adhered to your ethical priorities. And they might feel like they have been unfairly maligned because they believe that they've done something appropriate based on
Mhm.
their ethical priorities. And now we start talking past each other. And that reinforces this problem. It makes it very hard to bridge.
So let me take that point and go back to you now, Paula. The way that Peter just developed that sense with respect to technology, with respect to behavioral science,
Mhm.
um, about group polarization, dogmatism. I'll call it a homogenization, a self-selecting homogenization of views, and then kind of almost a Manichaean situation. We
Mm.
are the good and you are the evil, and there can be nothing in between us. Paula, you're a university administrator. You've been a dean. You were telling me for the past 10 years. From one vantage, this would be a pretty straightforward criticism of elite American higher education, that there is a homogenization going on in selective universities of worldview and of who's right and who's wrong about things. And then there are these eruptions that come of that. In other words, that the university itself, which is supposed to be a space for heterogeneity and
Mm.
difference and suppleness, actually all of that is still claimed, but it's within a pretty straightforward box that tends to be homogenous and more or less left progressive. Is there something to that critique, and that's actually the university is is eroding conversation in how it's living out its life as a university? Is there something to that? And then does it speak maybe to the public lack of trust in an institution like that?
Yeah, I do think there's truth in that. And it's a very complex set of reasons how
Hmm.
why this came about. I mean, I could tag, for example, the you're an English professor, so you know the rise of postmodern theory and
Hmm.
deconstruction that became in the humanities, that became a way of thinking about culture as based on power relationships, the powerful, the oppressors, and the oppressed. It got simplified to that form.
Hmm.
I mean, starting with Foucault, who didn't necessarily mean it that way, but it then developed into I think this polarization of the strong and the weak, the oppressor and the oppressed. I think that's one part. It's a very simplistic way of thinking, and you would think that the university would not latch onto it without any thinking. But I think it also maybe, as I'm talking, I'm thinking it also goes back to perhaps the 1960s with the idea that everything is really political. So
Yes.
you can't be neutral. You have to be on the side of, of the good and the right and the resistance. And so that became a kind of reflexive idea within the university, and it's sort of atrophied or ossified into the notion of, a more left-leaning, righteous position. The old style liberal, of which I think of myself as one, was someone who was open to other positions and ideas as opposed to being dogmatically attached
Hmm.
to one left-leaning position. But I think that the younger scholars are more and more attached to a certain brand of progressivism that is a problem. I mean, it used to be that it was easy for a professor to take the devil's advocate position within a class, for example. And now you have to be careful about that. Or you would encourage students to take a controversial or a contradictory point of view to get some texture going in the classroom.
Yes.
But I think that becomes less likely. Randy, I would ask you whether you see that happening in your classroom as an English professor
I,
nowadays.
I mean, I very much do. I used to use an English version of Sartre's concept of thinking against yourself. And so
Uh-huh.
when I would have a student who would have a particularly dogmatic view on something, I would say, well, that was really well said. Now think against yourself, because it's still your opportunity, but now let's see what's going to happen if you had to completely go against what you
Uh-huh.
just thought. And I would say students seem less willing or able to think against themselves. What I understand it to be sometimes is a fear of how their classmates will perceive them,
Yeah.
that they might be on the wrong side of something. I noticed it in a really dramatic way when teaching online during the pandemic. And I know, Paul, you talk a little bit about this later in the book, especially when it comes to Shakespeare and Zoom.
Yeah.
But teaching online during the pandemic, I was struck by one particular experience. I taught Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the Quentin Tarantino movie,
Uh-huh.
and there was an extended conversation about anti-Asian racism, specific to the Brad Pitt stuntman character beating up Bruce Lee at one point in the movie, and that this was taken as a critique of Asia, or as a diminishment of Bruce Lee as an Asian male. And it was a good conversation. Everything was going well. And then a student, virtual, put in the chat, I agree with everything that's been said, and I still think it's a really good movie. And
Ah,
he was just attacked
really?
over and
He was a
over again in the chat for, and what was fascinating to me was that he kept kind of peeping up saying, I agree with the criticism, and it's still a good movie. But, Peter, the hive mentality online was such that this was not acceptable. You couldn't
Now,
call this a
Randy,
good
let me
movie.
ask you, did you have the authority as the teacher to break up the hive mentality?
What I was able to do was pull out from it the point he was making and then try to resituate it into a larger conversation about, well, is Tarantino let's talk about representation of other groups in the movie. Does he, where do we
Yeah.
see him? I kind of went in that direction. And and the funny thing, of course, is that no one responded to me the same way, but the conversation kind of withered and went away. But there
Huh.
was much more interest in pushing down. I am confident we wouldn't have had that experience if we were in a room together. Why? Because to something Peter had said earlier, there would have been a sense of embodied experience. I can see the body language of the guy saying it's still a good movie. He's not a jerk. He's not racist. He's just making a point here.
Yeah.
And the implication being, why are we studying it in an English
But do
class at
you
the
think it's
university?
connected? Do you think it's connected to a lack of playfulness? That, I
Mm,
mean, after all, playfulness is, to me, a part of intellectual life. If you
yes.
can't be playful, if you can't develop a playful mind, you're not going to be a really educated person and you're not going to enjoy knowledge.
Mhm.
And I wonder if playfulness, and I wonder how it connects with humor, sarcasm, these issues, have we lost some of that? And I'll ask our social scientists because I wonder what happens when humor and playfulness atrophy.
Yeah. Well, if I could, I'll reframe
Yeah,
exactly what you just
yeah.
said to Peter. Peter, it seems to me like we're in this terrible circular situation. You need trust in
Mm,
order to be able to make a joke in class. But because I don't trust you, I won't make a joke or I won't laugh at your joke, which,
yeah.
so what do you think about playfulness and trust?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. I admire the student for having expressed that sentiment. I do think there's value in that moment for the class as a whole, because the evidence indicates that having just a minority voice
Mm.
uh,
Mhm.
can get the group to start thinking about the situation in a different way. And so uh, there's this idea in
Unless
group
they
psychology.
refuse to, unless they refuse to think about it in a different way, though.
Mhm.
Right, right. So this gets to this choice that we have in society, especially when our values differ. We can either address that difference through dialogue or through
Mhm.
domination.
Mm.
Mm.
And the preference and the easier course is domination if you can get away with
Yeah,
it. Right? And
right.
so that's the dynamic that was in your class. The group thought, okay, we can suppress this voice and convince that person that he was wrong and so on. Um, that was the preferred mode. And then suddenly you spoke up. Domination became a less
Yeah.
viable, path. And then suddenly they took a step back and realized that maybe they weren't, as correct in this matter as they had assumed. And so I think it's great that you chimed in there to support the fact that this was not necessarily such, a comment that should be chastised in that way.
But
So
he said that the conversation withered.
It withered. That's the thing. It didn't
Withered.
go
I love
anywhere.
that word, withered, because it should have really, thrived.
Yes.
But I do think it has to do, there are times when one person speaking up breaks it open. And there
Yes.
is, it depends. Often has to do with the personality of the student. It has to do with the confidence of the student. It has to do with the trust within the class, or if there's even a germ of trust in the class. And if there's a sense of humor, if somebody laughs, right? At that. I mean,
Yes.
that's a funny comment. I still like it's still a good movie. It's fun.
Yeah.
That's funny. It's fun.
Yeah.
But, if nobody is going to take that bait, then it will wither, right? It
Yes.
will die.
I think that's right. And so what we're talking about here is maybe a choice amongst lesser evils.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Having it wither is better than having the group maintain the view that that person was wrong and that they have succeeded in dominating that one dissenting voice.
Right.
What would have been better is if it led to a
Yes.
continued conversation. So it never got there, but at least it stopped one direction of that sort of sentiment from overwhelming what happened. It stopped it from getting worse. It, ideally, in a face-to-face setting, it could have moved into a direction of it getting better.
Yeah.
But usually that sort of thing takes time. So
Yeah.
for,
Well
for
said.
people to have their mindset changed like that, they need to reflect on it. They need to step away from it and not feel like they are being coerced into adopting a view that they didn't initially accept. They need to
Yes.
come to it through different means.